There is little doubt that the coronavirus pandemic will have lasting effects on the aviation industry, but to what extent will these effects be felt? And can the airline industry ever truly recover? Let's take a closer look. The first question I want to look at is, are we truly at more of a risk when we fly? Well, the answer isn't quite as simple as you would expect it to be. The obvious risk of flying commercially is the close quarters. As almost all of us know by now, the CDC recommends that we stay at least 6 feet away from people. This will mitigate the risk of us catching an infectious disease. Obviously, on an airplane, you're not anywhere near 6 feet away from people. But beyond that, are you really breathing recirculated air when you're on an airplane? Well, yes and no. While some of the air you are breathing is technically recirculated, there's a better way to explain it. The air that you breathe inside of an airplane needs to be pressurized. This means that there needs to be more air inside the cabin of the aircraft than outside of it. This is because at the normal cruising altitude of an aircraft, the air outside the airplane is too thin to breathe normally. To accomplish this pressurization of air, we use what's known as bleed air from the engine. In other words, it's excess air that is diverted into a duct system. This air then travels through the ducts through an air cycling machine. The air cycling machine takes away the moisture from the air. After that, the air is moved into what's known as a mixed manifold. The mixed manifold conditions the air and then puts it into the cabin. After that, the air is then sucked back into the system and passes through what's known as a HEPA filter. A HEPA filter is a high-efficiency particulate air filter. The HEPA filter absorbs anything bigger than 0.03 micrometers. These are the same type of filters that are used in hospitals. So the air that you're actually breathing on an airplane is just as clean as a hospital. Due to the fact that the air has been stripped of its moisture, it actually helps reduce the spread of illnesses. Not only that, but the air is completely replenished every 2 to 3 minutes, meaning that the air you breathe in an airplane is completely new air every 2 to 3 minutes, which is way better than almost any other indoor environment. So let's talk about the travel itself. If we stop air travel completely, will that stop the spread of the virus? The answer is more nuanced than you may expect. The World Health Organization conducted a study to determine the effectiveness of travel bans. The study concludes that extensive restriction on international air travel might delay introduction of a pandemic by up to 2 months and delay its spread by up to 3 to 4 months, but with limited effectiveness. They also stated that it would not, quote, prevent introduction of a pandemic into a given country. They went on to say that it would have minimal impact on the magnitude of pandemics. They showed that it typically reduced the attack rates by only 0.02% in their simulations. They even said that these bans may prolong the season and result in a higher epidemic peak. In other words, they're saying if you flatten the curve too much, it may result in 2 peaks instead of just 1. This occurred in the 1918 Spanish flu, where it had 2 peaks both in the spring and the fall. Regardless of the effectivity of these travel bans that we're experiencing now, there will be significant losses to the aviation industry. According to the International Air Transport Association, we can expect losses of up to $113 billion. We've already started to see the economic impact on international airlines. One of the first critical blows to the airline industry was the travel ban enacted by the United States to Europe. The transatlantic route is one of the most profitable routes for airlines. Not to mention, it's one of the busiest routes in the world with over 1,700 flights a day. Soon after this ban, the airline Flybe announced that they would be declaring bankruptcy. We've also seen 2 more airlines follow suit, Compass and Trans-State Airlines. We've seen Norwegian lay off half of its workforce. More than 55 airlines worldwide have now completely suspended operations. The airspace over India has officially closed. And now we're seeing multiple countries close their borders entirely, such as the Czech Republic, Poland, and Ukraine. Egypt has closed their airports. Emirates has suspended their flights until further notice. The airline KLM has retired its 747 fleet a year early. Qantas announced its plan to reduce its international travel by 90%. And Lufthansa, which is one of the biggest airlines in the world, is now only flying these international routes. This graph here shows some of the most vulnerable international airlines and how many days of cash they have left in reserve. The airlines in the United States are not faring any better. American Airlines is now only flying 3 international routes. Furthermore, they have announced a 75% reduction in flights. As a part of their reduction in operations, they've announced that they are parking 130 of their 150 wide-body aircraft and another 320 of their 800 narrow-body aircraft. Just to put this all in perspective a little bit, American Airlines has the second most routes in the entire world, and they are slashing their operations. Delta Airlines, the highest earning airline in the entire world, is now only flying 6 European flights a day. They've announced that they're reducing their flights by 70%, and they will be parking half of their entire fleet. And United, that flies to more destinations than any other airline in the entire world, at 373 destinations, is now only flying 6 international routes. Southwest, the 4th biggest airline in the United States, is reducing its flights by 37.5%. JetBlue has announced that they're only making $4 million a day, which is down from this time last year, making $22 million a day. With the airlines in such disarray, what does that mean for the aircraft manufacturers? For those of you who are unfamiliar with aircraft manufacturers, it's essentially a duopoly, meaning that there are 2 companies that pretty much control the entire market. These companies are Boeing and Airbus. Together, Boeing and Airbus command a 91% market share of the commercial aviation industry. Boeing is the single largest manufacturing exporter in the United States. But they've recently encountered a lot of problems. The problems for Boeing really started with the 737 MAX. The 737 MAX is Boeing's new 737 variant. Keeping in mind that the 737 is one of the most successful models in commercial aviation history. But after 2 crashes of their new 737 MAX, Boeing is in a horrible spot. It has been grounded by the FAA until they can prove its airworthiness. Boeing took a bigger hit this year than they did in the 2008 recession and post 9/11. Their stock has sunk so low, it's at the same level it was in 2013. In fact, Boeing has slipped so far that their only competitor, Airbus, is starting to make serious ground on them. In response to Boeing's woes, they have asked the government for a bailout of $60 billion. This asking of the government for assistance has led to the resignation of Nikki Haley, former governor and Boeing board member. When stating the reason for her resignation, she said that she was philosophically opposed to Boeing asking the government for money. If you want to learn more about Boeing and the troubles they face, let me know down in the comments below what you want me to discuss. Boeing's main competitor, Airbus, is also in a tight spot, but they're not in nearly as bad of a position as Boeing is. Unlike Boeing, Airbus is coming off of the best performing years Airbus has ever seen. Their stock has plummeted too, but only to where it was in 2017. And also, unlike Boeing, they have stated publicly that they will not be seeking government assistance. They have stated that they have access to $32 billion in liquid assets that they can leverage to make it through this hard time. In order for us to really understand and be able to predict what's going to happen to the airline industry, we can look at the most recent interruption to the airline industry. That interruption was 9/11. 9/11 was the first and only time the United States has ever completely shut down its airspace. This had immediate dramatic effects for all of the airliners' bottom lines. Not only that, but it shook passengers' confidence in the safety of air travel. Ridership fell through the floor. The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, made the comparison of COVID-19 to 9/11 as well. He said the following, quote, "This is worse than 9/11 for the airline industry. They are ground to a halt." And for him to say that is a very big deal. And here's why. After 9/11, 3 major airline companies declared bankruptcy. This included American West, a major airliner at the time, who declared bankruptcy just 10 days after September 11th. These bankruptcies included U.S. Airways in 2002 and 2004, United in 2002, Delta, Northwest, and Conair Airlines in 2005. To understand why these airlines fared so poorly, we can look at the numbers here. This graph right here shows how many cash reserves these airlines had left 10 days after 9/11. These airlines were operating on razor-thin margins. Most of these airlines wouldn't be able to make it through a month or two without consistent cash flow. The situation was so dire that Congress acted almost immediately, and 15 days after September 11th gave them a $15 billion bailout. But that wasn't enough to keep these airlines afloat. In total, these airlines needed up to $71 billion in bailouts. Even with all the bailouts given to them, many of them were not able to survive. Prior to 9/11, there were 9 major airlines controlling 80% of the market. Now there's only 4 airlines controlling 80% of that same market. The airlines that survived were Delta, United, Southwest, and American Airlines. To get to this point, from the years of 2005 to 2016, there were 15 mergers and acquisitions within the airline industry. Former big players in the airline industry, such as Continental, U.S. Airways, and Northwest, all went ahead and merged with other companies such as United, Delta, and American Airlines. Which brings us to today. Can these airlines survive again? With the recent $2 trillion government stimulus plan, the airline industry is going to get $58 billion of government stimulus. But for these airlines to be eligible to receive the bailout money, there are some stipulations. One of these stipulations is that the company will be prohibited from buying back stocks of their own company for a year. For those of you who don't know what a stock buyback is, it's when the company buys back its own stock from investors. The reason that they would want to do this is for the company to start to retain more of a portion of their company again. It's also a way to appease those investors they're buying their stock back from. Another stipulation is that executive compensation will be capped at 2019 levels. In other words, those executives won't be getting raises this year. CEOs of the major airline companies can make anywhere from $10 to $15 million a year. Another stipulation of this bailout money is that the government would take an equity interest in the company until the loan is paid off. The last stipulation I'm going to cover is that they cannot lay off employees until August 31st of 2020. In addition to the $58 billion allocated to the airline industry, there's an additional $17 billion being allocated to defense contractors. A good portion of this $17 billion is expected to be heading towards Boeing. Boeing has not commented on whether or not that $17 billion is actually intended for them. But if this were the case, it would definitely help Boeing out. As far as my prediction to whether or not Boeing will survive this ordeal, we just have to look back to 2008. The government infamously bailed out the automotive industry, deeming it too big to fail. And I'll tell you one thing, if Chrysler is considered by the government to be too big to fail, then Boeing is without a doubt too big to fail. Boeing itself has over 150,000 employees, but that doesn't include the millions of Americans that are directly tied to the success of Boeing. So no matter what happens, the government will not allow its biggest exporting manufacturer to fail. Having said all that, I know that bailouts are an incredibly polarizing subject. Oftentimes these bailouts are easily passed, but more often than not, they are highly criticized after the fact. We saw this backlash after the September 11th bailouts, and we also saw it after the 2008 recession bailouts. Critics of the bailout are quick to say that these companies put themselves in this situation, and the burden of pulling them out of these situations should not be pushed on the taxpayer, especially when these companies oftentimes make huge layoffs even after they receive bailout money. And while all of this has happened, the executives and CEOs of these companies managed to escape without a dent in their bank account. Proponents of the airline industry bailouts will tell you that the airlines are critical infrastructure for the United States. Not only that, but millions of Americans would be at risk for losing their jobs. There's over 10 million people employed in the aviation industry. Without these government bailouts, they would be at risk of losing their livelihood. And these proponents do have a fair argument. After September 11th, over 96,000 people lost their jobs. We do see that Congress has addressed some of the issues that have revolved around bailouts in the past. That's why we see some of the stipulations that I talked about earlier that the government has enacted. But then their question arises, will the $58 billion the government is offering to the airlines be enough to save them? We saw that the $15 billion in bailout money that the government gave the airline industry after September 11th did help the airline industry, but only for a little bit. As we already discussed, several of them ended up filing for bankruptcy in years following anyways. So I would say that it's fair to conclude that we're going to see the same type of thing happen to the airlines we have today. But when we're making these kind of predictions to how the airline industry is going to survive after coronavirus, we have to realize that 9/11 isn't exactly the same situation. Unlike 9/11, coronavirus has affected the entire airline industry, not mostly focused on the US industry like it was for 9/11. Passenger confidence has never been rocked like it has for coronavirus. We have never seen an interruption in flights that has lasted as long as this has. A best case scenario for the airline industry is that we see some sort of semblance of normalcy towards the end of April or early May. Worst case scenario is we see a small uptick in the summertime, but then we get a second wave like we did for the Spanish flu of 1918, and ridership drops again in the fall. I see this as the less likely scenario, but it is a grim one. How long will it take before passengers and governments feel it's safe to fly again? Only time will tell. If I could venture an educated guess, I would say mid to early summertime. The $58 billion in bailout loans is certainly enough to keep the airline industry alive for the moment. But unfortunately, I don't believe that this will be enough to keep some of the weaker airlines alive. We can almost certainly expect future bankruptcies from smaller airlines with slimmer margins, and we can also expect a fair number of mergers and acquisitions. But what does that mean for us, the passenger? The first thing to consider is some of the procedural changes that will occur. 9/11 changed the way that airlines do business forever. In response to 9/11, the US government established an agency known as TSA. Since its establishment, they've enforced several safety precautions that now are standard practice around the world. For instance, they enacted the rules on the restrictions of liquids you can bring on an airplane. 9/11 forever changed the way we do air travel. It may be too soon to say for sure what permanent changes will be a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we know for sure that airlines have made immediate changes. Some countries and some airlines have started to change the way that we board aircraft. Some of these initial changes include things like screening passengers before they board the aircraft to make sure that they're not exhibiting any flu-like symptoms. I do not, however, foresee that this will last very much long after the COVID-19 pandemic, as this makes the boarding process, which is already tedious, excruciating. Not to mention the increase in equipment and man hours that this would require the airlines to provide. I bet that most of you have heard from every single company you've ever given your email to about what their COVID-19 response looks like. And this includes airlines. Airlines have dramatically enhanced the way that they sterilize the aircraft now. Most airlines before coronavirus very rarely clean the floors and the tray tables and most of the surfaces on the aircraft. But as we can see in this video, major airliners have started to shift the way they sanitize the aircraft. I can definitely see them enacting this more regularly even after the coronavirus pandemic. So what can passengers expect as far as cost of flying? If you've looked at flights recently, you'll notice that of course the airline tickets are incredibly cheap. We can expect this now and for the immediate future. As any economist will tell you, as there's a decrease in demand, there's also a decrease in price. Couple that loss of demand with the extraordinarily cheap cost of jet fuel right now, and you'll see why these flights are so cheap. I bet this is probably the cheapest that we will ever see flights in our generation. In the short term, these companies are going to fight tooth and nail to get us on their planes. But if business doesn't start to pick up by summertime, we can expect these airlines to start taking more drastic measures. We can expect the weaker airlines to start making layoffs after the moratorium on layoffs. And if this still doesn't solve the problem for these weaker airlines, they're going to be faced with a difficult decision. These companies in these dire situations will be faced with only a few options. They can merge with another company, or if they have a buyer, they can be bought out by the company, or they'll be faced with bankruptcy. And this is where we start to see the real downside for the passengers. That means these airlines no longer have to compete as much to get our business. In layman's terms, they can start to charge us more money. If we've learned anything in the commercial aviation industry, it's that it's volatile. However, the scale of the COVID-19 interruption is totally unprecedented. Luckily for these airlines, it comes at a time when people were flying more than ever. So although these airlines are at a much better place than they were in 9/11, I still believe we can see similar, if not worse, results. Just as you and I should have 3 to 6 months of expenses saved up, I believe these companies need to have a similar stash of money. These executives should know by now that this is an incredibly volatile industry. They need to plan for these events. They need to diversify their companies and make better decisions to have liquid assets in the case of these emergencies. But one thing's for sure, this will change the future of commercial aviation forever. Having said all of this, if I could make one prediction, it's that the aviation industry will survive. Commercial aviation has brought us together in ways our forefathers would have never dreamt of. As a species, we're traveling like we never have before. That innate desire that lives within us all will persist even after this disaster. And although we're going through some difficult times right now, we can rest assured that we will persevere. One of humanity's defining traits is our ability to adapt and overcome. We still possess the desire to explore and experience new places and cultures. This will not go away just because of a pandemic. And whenever there's a demand for something, there's always someone there to meet that demand. So we can rest assured that the aviation industry will recover. We will get through this. The stock market will recover, just as it always has and always will. There's always a silver lining in everything. For instance, if you're young, this may be the cheapest time we will ever see to invest. So if you want to be more financially stable than the airlines, now is a great time to start investing. And if you want a free way to start, click on the link in my description and download the app Robinhood. Just for signing up, you'll get a free stock. There's also a link to another app called Webull. You'll also get a free stock for signing up there. Thank you all so much for watching. If you found this informative, please give this video a like. If you're interested in hearing more about the aviation industry, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks again for watching, and Godspeed.